What if the 20th century had been shaped not by George V, but by his forgotten brother, heir to the British throne? His name is Prince Albert Victor. He was erased by history at 28, but his death quietly reshaped the British monarchy and the world that followed. He arrived early, too early in fact, born on the 8th of January 1864, 2 months before his time, in the rooms of Frogmore House at Windsor. His mother, Princess Alexandra of Denmark, had only recently married the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, and the premature birth sent the royal household into a controlled panic. The baby was small, fragile. The local clergyman was summoned in haste to perform an emergency baptism, so uncertain were the physicians of the child's survival. But survive he did. He was named Albert Victor, a name carrying the entire weight of Victorian dynastic ambition in just 2 words. Albert, for his great-grandfather, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the beloved consort of Queen Victoria, dead barely 2 years before the boy's birth, and still mourned with an almost theatrical intensity by the grieving queen, and Victor for Victoria herself, who held dominion over more of the earth's surface than any monarch in recorded history. From his first breath, this child was not simply a baby, he was a symbol, a continuation, a flesh-and-blood argument for the permanence and righteousness of the British crown. Queen Victoria herself was complex in her feelings about her grandchildren. She adored them in the abstract, as extensions of her dynasty, as proof of her enduring genetic legacy, but she could be sharp, critical, even cold with individual children who failed to meet her considerable standards. Albert Victor, she noted early on, seemed slow, quiet in a way that concerned her. He did not have the sparkle of his father, the gregarious, pleasure-loving Prince of Wales, who lit up every room he entered with the particular charisma of a man born to be liked. Nor did he have the focused intellectual energy of his mother's family. He was, in the estimation of most who observed him in those early years, a gentle boy, affectionate, eager to please, but not quick. His younger brother George, born in June of 1865, barely 18 months after Albert Victor, was almost everything Albert Victor was not. George was alert, decisive, clear-eyed, and possessed of a discipline that would define his entire adult life. The two brothers were inseparable as boys, educated together, playing together, sailing together on the royal yacht. But already, even in childhood, observers began to note a difference. Where George was a boy who seemed to know his own mind, Albert Victor seemed to be waiting for someone to make it up for him. The world into which Albert Victor was born was one trembling on the edge of transformation. The British Empire in 1864 was at the zenith of its confidence. Cotton from India, gold from South Africa, tea from Ceylon, rubber from Malaya, and the Royal Navy patrolling the seas of every continent. Queen Victoria ruled over roughly 400 million people, a quarter of the world's population, on territories covering nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. This was not merely a political fact, it was a psychological one. To be British in the 1860s, and to be royal British, was to inhabit a worldview in which Britain's dominance seemed not just advantageous, but natural, divinely ordained even. And yet the certainties were beginning to fracture. In Germany, Bismarck was forging a new empire from the steel and blood of the Franco-Prussian War. In America, the wounds of civil war were still raw. In Ireland, Fenian agitators were planting bombs in English cities. And at home, the Reform Acts were slowly, inevitably expanding the franchise, bringing more and more ordinary men into the electoral process and raising the uncomfortable question of how long an unelected monarchy could maintain its authority over an increasingly democratic nation. Into this world, Albert Victor would grow, and it would shape him in ways neither he nor those around him fully understood. In 1877, when Albert Victor was 13 years old, the decision was made that would perhaps most profoundly shape and arguably damage his development. Rather than receiving a conventional education with private tutors at home, as had been the custom for royal children, Albert Victor and his brother George were sent to sea. They joined the Royal Navy training ship HMS Britannia, and then embarked on a 3-year voyage around the world aboard HMS Bacchante under the supervision of their tutor, the Reverend John Neil Dalton. Dalton was a conscientious man. He kept meticulous records of the voyage, which he later published in 2 volumes, a detailed account of the prince's travels through the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, South America, South Africa, Australia, Japan, China, Egypt, and the Holy Land. For George, the experience was transformative. He took to naval life with a passion that would define his character for the rest of his days. For Albert Victor, it was something rather different. Dalton's private reports to the Queen and to the Prince of Wales paint a worrying picture. Albert Victor, he wrote, was listless and apathetic. He found it difficult to concentrate. He tired easily, both physically and intellectually. He did not retain information well. He seemed, in Dalton's careful but damning phrase, to be constitutionally incapable of sustained mental effort. Historians have long debated what exactly was wrong with Albert Victor, if indeed anything was clinically wrong at all. Some have suggested a mild form of what we would today call a learning disability, perhaps dyslexia or attention deficit disorder, conditions that were entirely unrecognized in Victorian medicine and would simply have appeared as stupidity or laziness to observers of the time. Others have pointed to a possible congenital hearing impairment, a condition that ran in his mother's family, which may have made it difficult for him to follow rapid speech and contributed to his apparent inattentiveness. Still others have suggested that the problem was primarily environmental, that being perpetually in his more capable brother's shadow had simply taught Albert Victor not to bother trying. What is certain is that the naval education, whatever its merits for George, was not well suited to Albert Victor. He returned from the voyage in 1882 with a command of the seas, a broad geographic knowledge from extensive travel, and relatively little else in the way of formal education. After the voyage, the brothers parted ways for the first time. George continued his naval career, which suited his temperament perfectly. Albert Victor, after a brief interlude, was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge, not because anyone believed he was academically inclined, but because it was felt that some exposure to university life might finish his education in the social graces, if not in the intellectual ones. At Cambridge, Albert Victor studied under James Kenneth Stephen, known as J.K. Stephen, a brilliant, mercurial, and deeply eccentric man who was a first cousin of Virginia Woolf and who would later descend into a mental illness that killed him. Stephen's relationship with Albert Victor has itself been the subject of considerable speculation over the years. What is clear is that Stephen was devoted to his royal pupil in a way that went beyond the merely professional, and that Albert Victor responded to this devoted attention with something approaching genuine affection. Stephen wrote poetry about Albert Victor, verse that was at times embarrassingly effusive in its admiration. But even Stephen, with all his gifts as a teacher, could not transform Albert Victor into a scholar. The prince spent time at Cambridge, attended lectures, participated in the social life of the university, and left without a degree. It was a trajectory that told its own story. What Cambridge did give Albert Victor, and this is perhaps more significant than any academic credential, was entry into a particular social world. The world of late Victorian upper-class England was one of country house parties, London clubs, horse racing, opera, gambling, and a complicated, semi-clandestine sexual underground that coexisted uneasily with the era's strident public morality. Albert Victor moved through this world. He was, by all accounts, charming in person, tall, slender, with his mother's dark eyes and a gentle manner that made people like him. He was not brilliant company, but he was pleasant company, and he wore his rank with an ease that suggested he had never questioned it. And it was in this world that the first serious whispers about Albert Victor's character began to circulate. Not yet publicly, the Victorian press, for all its appetite for scandal, maintained certain proprieties around the royal family that the modern tabloid newspaper would find incomprehensible. But privately, in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs, questions were being asked about the prince's associations, about his choices of companion, about the nature of his private life. In 1889, those whispers exploded into something considerably more alarming. The Cleveland Street scandal, in which a male brothel operating in the West End of London was found to be patronized by a number of aristocratic and upper-class clients, some of them connected to royal circles, sent shockwaves through the establishment. The principal clients, where they could be identified, were quietly encouraged to leave the country or were given light sentences. But the name that the gutter press and the radical political opposition longed to print, and that only the threat of prosecution for criminal libel prevented them from printing, was that of Prince Albert Victor. Whether Albert Victor was actually a client of the Cleveland Street brothel has never been definitively established. The evidence is circumstantial. The allegations came primarily from sources with strong political motives to damage the monarchy. But the mere fact that such allegations were being made and suppressed tells us something important about the position Albert Victor occupied in the public imagination. He was a prince whose private life was considered, by those who claimed to know, to be at odds with the public morality his family represented. By the late 1880s, Albert Victor was heir apparent in all but name. His father, the Prince of Wales, stood between him and the throne, but Edward VII was a man of robust, if sometimes excessive, appetites, and his eventual accession to the throne seemed assured. Albert Victor in time would follow. The question of who would stand beside him as Queen of England was therefore not merely a personal matter. It was a matter of European politics. The search for a suitable bride for Albert Victor occupied the royal family, and in particular Queen Victoria, for several years in the late 1880s. Victoria was a woman who understood with absolute clarity that royal marriages were instruments of foreign policy, and she worked the chessboard of European dynastic connection with the single-minded focus of a grandmaster. Her preferred candidate for Albert Victor was Princess Alix of Hesse, a granddaughter of Victoria's own, a gentle, deeply religious girl of great beauty and quiet intelligence who would later, as Empress of Russia, meet a fate too terrible to imagine. Victoria believed Alix would be good for Albert Victor, would steady him, would give him purpose. But Albert Victor had other ideas. He had fallen in love, genuinely, perhaps for the first time in his life, in love. The object of his affection was Princess Helene of Orleans, daughter of the Comte de Paris and a claimant to the French throne. She was Catholic. Albert Victor was heir to the British crown, and under the Act of Settlement of 1701, no British monarch could marry a Catholic, nor could any member of the line of succession contract such a marriage without Parliament's consent and the effective forfeiture of their place in the succession. The obstacles were, in practical political terms, nearly insurmountable. And yet Albert Victor pressed his suit with an ardor that surprised everyone who observed it. Here, finally, was the prince showing something like genuine passion, genuine agency. Helene herself was willing. She wrote to her father that she was prepared to convert to Anglicanism for the sake of the marriage. The Comte de Paris refused. Pope Leo XIII, consulted privately, also refused to countenance a conversion. Queen Victoria, who had privately hoped the obstacles might somehow be overcome, she seems to have genuinely liked Helene and recognized Albert Victor's sincere feeling, ultimately acknowledged that the match was impossible. The failure of the Helene romance left Albert Victor, by those who observed him in the autumn of 1890, noticeably diminished. Something of the brief animation that the relationship had brought him seemed to drain away. He was 26 years old. He was heir to the greatest empire on earth, and he seemed, to those who knew him well, profoundly unhappy. It was at this point, the autumn and winter of 1890 to 1891, that another scandal broke over his head. A woman named Annie Elizabeth Crook, a shop girl from the East End of London, was rumored to have secretly married the prince and to have borne him a child. The story, which gained its most famous articulation in the 1970 book Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution by Stephen Knight, formed the basis of an elaborate conspiracy theory that would eventually link Albert Victor's name to the most notorious unsolved murders in British criminal history. The Ripper murders, 5 women killed in the Whitechapel district of London between August and November of 1888, their bodies mutilated with what appeared to be surgical precision, remain to this day officially unsolved. They generated an immediate and massive public sensation, and that sensation has never entirely subsided. In the century and more since the murders, an estimated 500 suspects have been named in print. Among them, proposed in earnest by serious investigators and dismissed with equal seriousness by others, is Prince Albert Victor himself. The case against Albert Victor rests primarily on circumstantial opportunity, that he was in London during the relevant periods, and on the conspiracy theory developed by Stephen Knight, which alleged that the murders were committed or commissioned by the royal household to silence witnesses to the secret marriage. The theory is colorful. It inspired films, novels, and television dramas. It has also been comprehensively demolished by historians and criminologists who have examined the evidence with rigor. Albert Victor's movements during the period of the murders have been traced with considerable precision by subsequent researchers, and he appears to have been verifiably elsewhere, in Scotland, in Germany, at various country estates, on the occasions when the murders were committed. But the accusation, however unfounded, tells us something important. It tells us that Albert Victor, in the popular imagination, was a figure already associated with the shadows, with the parts of Victorian life that respectable society preferred not to examine too directly. The rumors about Cleveland Street, the doomed romance with a Catholic princess, the shadowy stories about secret marriages and illegitimate children. Whether any of these things were true or false, they had combined to create a public image of the heir to the throne as a man whose private life was dangerously out of control. The palace responded with urgency. Albert Victor needed a wife. He needed one immediately, and this time sentiment would have to yield to strategy. The chosen bride was Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known to her family as May. She was the daughter of Francis, Duke of Teck, and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a first cousin of Queen Victoria's. May was everything that the situation demanded. She was Protestant, she was of royal blood, she had an excellent education and a formidable intelligence. She was also, in the assessment of virtually everyone who knew her, considerably more capable than the prince she was to marry. The engagement was announced in December of 1891. It was received with general public satisfaction. The newspapers praised both parties. The royal family expressed its relief. Queen Victoria wrote that she was much pleased. Even Albert Victor seemed genuinely happy. May was attractive, warm in private, and possessed of a quality of steady good sense that might conceivably have provided the anchor he had always lacked. The wedding was set for the 27th of February, 1892. It never happened.
The winter of 1891 to 1892 was bitter across England. A pandemic of influenza, then called La Grippe, was sweeping through Europe with a lethal efficiency that modern epidemiologists have since compared to the great influenza pandemic of 1918. It killed young and old alike. It was indifferent to rank. Albert Victor celebrated his 28th birthday on the 8th of January 1892 at Sandringham, the Prince of Wales's country estate in Norfolk. Within days he was ill. The influenza developed quickly into pneumonia. in the era before antibiotics, a diagnosis that often amounted to a death sentence, particularly in patients whose constitutions were already weakened by the demands of recent illness. The family gathered. Princess Alexandra, his mother, who had always been perhaps his most devoted champion, the one person who refused to see him as a disappointment, kept vigil at his bedside. The Prince of Wales, his father, sat in the corridor outside. His siblings were present. May, his fiancée, came to Sandringham, though accounts differ on precisely how much time she spent at his bedside and how clearly she understood in those first days that the situation was truly desperate. Albert Victor was delirious for much of the final week. He called out names. He spoke fragments of sentences that no one around him understood. His temperature climbed, his breathing labored. The physicians, including the royal physician Sir William Gull, who would himself later be named as a Ripper suspect in yet another conspiracy theory, could offer nothing but rest, nursing care, and the hope that a strong constitution would fight its way through. Albert Victor's constitution was not strong enough. On the morning of the 14th of January, 1892, 6 weeks before his scheduled wedding, 4 days before he would have been created Duke of Clarence and Avondale in a ceremony to mark the approaching marriage, he died. The Prince of Wales, standing at the bedside of his eldest son, reportedly wept without restraint. Alexandra, whose composure had held throughout the long vigil, collapsed. The court went into deep mourning. Queen Victoria, receiving the news at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, wrote in her journal with the particular laconic grief of a woman who had buried a husband and now buried a grandson, "It was very sad. Poor Albert Victor is no more." The public response was extraordinary. The London streets were hung with black crepe. The newspapers ran extended obituaries. Memorial cards were sold in their hundreds of thousands. There was something in the public mourning for Albert Victor that went beyond mere loyalty to the crown. There was a genuine emotional response, a sense of the particular pathos of young death, of potential unfulfilled, of a life cut short before it had properly begun. He was buried in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, in a tomb that would become itself an object of devoted attention. May, his fiancée, who would marry his brother George within a year and eventually become Queen Mary, regularly sent flowers to his grave for the rest of her very long life. Whether this was love, guilt, or a kind of ritual fidelity to the version of the future that had been denied, no one who knew her ever said with certainty.
The history that follows Albert Victor's death is, in a very real sense, the history of what might have been and of what actually was. George, his brother, now became the heir. He married May of Teck, a match that, by all subsequent accounts, proved to be a genuine success, built on mutual respect, shared duty, and, in time, real affection. They had 6 children. George became King George V in 1910 on the death of Edward VII, and reigned until his own death in 1936. He was, in the judgment of history, a good king, not a brilliant one, not an imaginative one, but a steady, responsible, constitutionally minded monarch who guided the British crown through some of the most turbulent decades in its history. The First World War, the Irish Revolution, the General Strike, the rise of fascism, the collapse of the old European order. Would Albert Victor have done the same? It is, by definition, impossible to know, but it is possible to make an informed assessment. Albert Victor, had he lived and succeeded to the throne, probably in 1910 or thereabouts on his father's death, would have become king in a world already teetering on the edge of catastrophe. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was 4 years away. The great European alliance systems were drawing ever tighter. The arms race between Britain and Germany was accelerating. A king who was slow to grasp complex political situations, who was susceptible to influence by strong-willed advisors, who had a private life that could at any point become a public scandal, such a king in 1914 might have been a serious liability. George V's role in the First World War is still debated, but what is clear is that he acted throughout with a constitutional propriety and a personal self-discipline that helped to hold the monarchy together through years that destroyed 4 other European royal dynasties: the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, the Habsburgs in Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans in Turkey. He visited the front lines repeatedly. He renounced alcohol for the duration of the war as a public gesture of solidarity with the working-class soldiers who had little choice in the matter. He changed the family name in 1917 from the German Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the resoundingly English Windsor, one of the most astute pieces of royal branding in history. Albert Victor, one suspects, would have struggled to do any of these things with equal conviction or equal effect. Not because he was a bad man, but because he was a weak one. And weakness in a constitutional monarch navigating the greatest crisis in European history since Napoleon might have been fatal. Not to the man, though the war killed plenty of men far fitter and younger than he, but to the institution. There is another consideration. The 20th century's most consequential royal succession, the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936, which brought the stuttering, private, duty-bound George VI to the throne, and which set in motion the particular public narrative of resilient royal service that would define the monarchy for the rest of the century. This crisis, too, traces its genealogy back to Albert Victor's death. Edward VIII was a son of George V. Had Albert Victor lived and reigned, there would have been no Edward VIII as king. The entire line of succession would have been different. The woman who became Queen Elizabeth II might never have been queen at all.
Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, has enjoyed a posthumous fame that would have astonished him in life. He has appeared as a character in novels, films, television series, and video games. He has been accused, in print, of being Jack the Ripper, a secret Catholic convert, a bigamist, and an agent of Masonic conspiracy. He has been defended, with equal passion, by biographers who argue that the accusations against him say more about the anxieties of the eras that made them than about the man himself. The serious historical consensus, as it has emerged over the past several decades of careful scholarly work, is this: Albert Victor was a young man of limited intellectual gifts and considerable personal vulnerability, who was born into a situation that made enormous demands on qualities he simply did not possess. He was not, on the available evidence, a murderer, a criminal, or a monster. He was, more sadly, something rather more ordinary, a person who had been given everything by birth and had been given, by nature, relatively little capacity to use it. But the myths that have accrued around him are not, for that reason, uninteresting. They tell us something real about the Victorians and their anxieties. The Cleveland Street scandal and the whispers about Albert Victor's sexuality were taking place in a society that was simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the hidden lives it suspected its elites were living. The Ripper connection spoke to a fear that the respectable surface of Victorian England concealed something violent and uncontrollable underneath. The conspiracy theories, in their various iterations, reflected a deep popular suspicion of the establishment, a conviction that the powerful protected their own at any cost. In 1972, a retired detective inspector named Arthur Douglas Home wrote what he claimed was a confession to having participated in the official suppression of Albert Victor's connection to the Cleveland Street scandal. The document's authenticity has been disputed. In 1991, 100 years after the murders, the criminologist Andrew Cook published what he considered a definitive debunking of the Ripper accusations. The debate continued regardless.
What has not continued, what ended on that cold January morning in 1892, is the life of the man himself. Albert Victor died, as far as we can tell, without understanding the significance of his own death. He died in delirium, calling out words that no one understood. He died weeks before a wedding that might or might not have given his life a new shape. He died as the century that would reshape the world was still gathering its forces beyond the horizon. And in dying, he handed to his quieter, steadier, more capable brother a crown that neither of them had fully expected George to wear. The House of Windsor, the name, the institution, the particular version of monarchy that has persisted into the 21st century was built on the absence of Albert Victor as much as on the presence of George V. It was shaped by his death as much as by his brother's life. He was 28 years old. He had never ruled. He had never governed. He had never, as far as we can tell, made a single decision that altered the course of history. And yet, history, in its particular perversity, arranged itself around his absence as completely as it might have arranged itself around his presence. The question that remains, the question that serious historians of the Victorian era continue to ask, is not what he did, it is what he might have done, and whether a slower, gentler, less certain hand on the tiller of the British Empire might have steered it differently through the storms that were coming. We cannot know. We can only observe with the clarity that hindsight gives us that the course was changed, that the currents of history ran in a different direction because one young man in a cold January in Norfolk could not breathe. And we can ask ourselves, perhaps, what it means for institutions, for nations, for the course of events that shapes all our lives when the person history chose and nature denied leaves behind not a legacy of action, but a legacy of absence.
Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was born on the 8th of January, 1864. He died on the 14th of January, 1892. He is buried in the Albert Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle beneath an effigy that represents him in the full armor of a medieval knight, more resolute in stone than he perhaps ever managed to be in life. His fiancée married his brother. His brother became king. His brother's son became king. His brother's son abdicated. His brother's son's daughter became perhaps the most famous queen in British history, whose reign ended with the particular completeness of long lives in 2022. And somewhere at the beginning of that long chain of consequence, there is Albert, quiet, gentle, not quite brilliant, not quite suited to the life that was waiting for him, gone before it could claim him, and yet, in the most unexpected of ways, more present in the history of the British crown than any monarch who actually wore it.